Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where every whisper echoes through centuries of tradition, one conversation would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. When King Charles III made a decision that would tear apart families and silence voices that had once been welcome in royal circles, nobody anticipated the earthquake that would follow. This isn't just another royal scandal. This is the untold story of how a king's choice to protect his crown led to a family war that the public never saw coming. The cameras captured the smiles, the ceremonies, and the perfect public moments. But behind closed doors, a different drama was unfolding, one where loyalty was tested, hearts were broken, and the price of wearing a crown became painfully clear. What happens when the most powerful man in Britain decides that some family ties are too dangerous to maintain? What follows is a story of power, betrayal, and the devastating silence that can destroy relationships built over decades. The palace tried to keep it quiet, but some secrets are too big to bury forever. Prepare yourself for the real story behind the headlines, a story that reveals how even kings can lose the people they once called family. The morning of September 8, 2022, changed everything for the British royal family. As news of Queen Elizabeth II's death spread across the world, Charles Philip Arthur George Windsor found himself transformed from heir apparent to King Charles III in the space of a single breath. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, settled upon his shoulders with the force of 1,000 years of tradition. But becoming king meant more than just inheriting a title. It meant making impossible choices that would define not just his reign, but the very survival of the monarchy in modern times. And sometimes, those choices would cut deeper than any sword, severing bonds that had taken decades to build. The Parker Bowles family had been part of Charles's life for over 30 years. When he first fell in love with Camilla Parker Bowles in the 1970s, he had also embraced her family, her children Tom and Laura, her siblings, her extended network of relatives who brought warmth and normalcy to a life otherwise constrained by protocol. Even during the difficult years when Charles was married to Diana and Camilla was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, these family connections remained important threads in the complex tapestry of his personal life. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had grown from a young boy who called Charles Uncle Charles to a successful food critic and author. He had navigated the complicated waters of having a stepfather who was heir to the throne with remarkable grace, always respectful of boundaries while maintaining genuine affection for the man who had become such an important figure in his mother's life. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, had followed a similar path, building her own family while remaining close to both her mother and Charles. For years, the Parker Bowles family had been welcome at royal gatherings. They attended weddings, christenings, and private family celebrations. They were photographed at public events, quoted in interviews, and generally accepted as part of the extended royal circle. Charles had walked Laura down the aisle at her wedding. He had been present for important milestones in Tom's career. These weren't just polite relationships maintained for appearance's sake. They were genuine family bonds. But as Charles ascended to the throne, the calculations that governed his life began to shift. The new king faced challenges that his mother had never encountered. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy among younger generations. Republican movements in Commonwealth countries were gaining strength. Social media had created an environment where every royal action was scrutinized, analyzed, and often criticized by millions of voices. In this new landscape, every relationship carried political weight. Every family member represented both an asset and a potential liability. And as Charles and his advisors began the delicate process of modernizing the monarchy while preserving its essential character, they made a cold assessment that would have devastating personal consequences. The Parker Bowles family, despite their years of loyalty and discretion, represented a complication that the new reign could not afford. Their presence served as a constant reminder of Charles's controversial past, of the affair that had helped destroy his first marriage, of the decades of scandal and speculation that had surrounded his relationship with Camilla. Every photo of Tom or Laura at a royal event triggered fresh commentary about the complex history that had brought their mother to the throne as queen consort. More troubling to Charles's advisors was the family's growing comfort with media attention. Tom Parker Bowles had built a successful career partly on his connection to royalty. His books and television appearances often included anecdotes about royal life, carefully chosen to be respectful but, nonetheless offering glimpses behind the palace walls that made courtiers nervous. Laura, while more private, had occasionally spoken to journalists about her family situation, always supportive but sometimes revealing details that the palace would have preferred to keep private. The decision, when it came, was framed as a necessary modernization. The new king, his advisors argued, needed to streamline the royal family, focusing public attention on the core working royals while reducing the periphery of extended family members who carried royal connection but no official role. It was presented as a strategic choice, essential for the monarchy's survival in the 21st century. But for the Parker Bowles family, strategy felt like betrayal. The phone calls became less frequent. Invitations to family gatherings stopped arriving. Requests for royal patronages were politely declined. Most painfully of all, the warm personal relationships that had sustained them through years of public scrutiny began to cool into formal politeness. Tom Parker Bowles, who had spent his adult life defending Charles and Camilla against critics, found himself increasingly isolated from the stepfather he had grown to respect and love. His calls to Clarence's house went unreturned. His attempts to arrange family dinners were met with excuses about busy schedules. The man who had once been a constant presence in his life became a distant figure hidden behind layers of protocol and advisors. Laura faced similar treatment. The woman who had seen Charles as a second father, who had valued his advice and support through her own challenges as a mother and wife, discovered that access to him now required formal channels and official appointments. The casual intimacy that had characterized their relationship for decades evaporated overnight. Camilla found herself caught in an impossible position. As the new queen consort, she understood the pressures facing her husband. She had lived through enough royal crises to know that sometimes personal relationships had to be sacrificed for the greater good of the institution. But she also watched in anguish as her children struggled to understand why the man they had considered family was suddenly treating them like strangers. The irony was cruel. Camilla had spent years being criticized for breaking up Charles's first marriage, for being the other woman who had caused so much pain to Princess Diana. Now, as she finally achieved the acceptance and recognition she had sought for decades, that very acceptance seemed to require cutting ties with the children who had supported her through the darkest periods of public hatred. Charles himself was not immune to the emotional cost of these decisions. In private moments, away from the advisors and protocol officers who shaped his daily life, he struggled with the knowledge that he was hurting people who had shown him nothing but loyalty. He remembered Tom's childhood, the boy who had accepted him into the family without question. He thought about Laura's wedding, the pride he had felt walking her down the aisle. These memories now carried the bitter taste of relationships sacrificed for reasons of state. But the pressure to modernize was relentless. Every decision Charles made as the new monarch was measured against the survival of the institution he had inherited. The advisors who surrounded him painted a stark picture of a monarchy under siege, where every unnecessary complication could prove fatal to public support. In this environment, the Parker Bowles family connections were seen as an indulgence the crown could no longer afford. The first public signs of the growing distance appeared in subtle ways. Royal photographers noticed that Tom and Laura were no longer included in family group shots at public events. Society reporters observed their absence from gatherings where they had previously been regular guests. The family's official biographers quietly removed references to the Parker Bowles relationships from updated royal genealogies. For those who knew how to read the signs, the message was clear: the Parker Bowles family was being written out of the royal story. The people who had stood by Charles and Camilla through decades of controversy were now seen as inconvenient reminders of a past that the new reign wanted to leave behind. The transformation was gradual, but relentless. Relationships that had weathered public scandals, media scrutiny, and family dramas could not survive the cold calculation of modern monarchy. The personal had become political, and in that transformation, something essential was lost, not just for the Parker Bowles family, but for the institution that had chosen efficiency over humanity. As the months passed after Charles's coronation, the silence grew deeper. Phone calls stopped altogether. Christmas invitations were not extended. The family that had once gathered regularly around Camilla's table found themselves scattered, connected now only by shared memories of a time when love had seemed more important than protocol. The foundation of relationships that had taken decades to build was cracking under the weight of royal duty. And, in those cracks, the seeds of a deeper crisis were beginning to take root, one that would eventually threaten not just personal relationships, but the very image of the monarchy Charles was trying so desperately to protect. The spring of 2023 brought with it a series of events that would make the growing distance between King Charles and the Parker Bowles family impossible to ignore. What had begun as subtle cooling in relationships was about to become a public spectacle that would embarrass the monarchy and devastate the people who had once called the King family. Tom Parker Bowles had always been careful about his public statements regarding his royal connections. As a food critic and author, he had built his career on talent rather than title, but he had never denied the reality of his relationship with Charles. In interviews, he spoke warmly but respectfully about his stepfather, always maintaining appropriate boundaries while acknowledging the man who had become such an important part of his mother's life. But in March 2023, something changed. Tom had been invited to speak at a food festival in Edinburgh, an event that would normally have been routine for someone of his professional standing. However, when the organizers mentioned his royal connections in their promotional materials, describing him as a stepson to King Charles III, the response from Clarence House was swift and uncompromising. A letter arrived at Tom's London home on official palace stationery, signed not by Charles himself, but by his private secretary. The language was formal, legalistic, and devastating in its implications. The palace, the letter explained, did not recognize any official family relationship between Tom Parker Bowles and His Majesty the King. Any public statements or promotional materials suggesting such a relationship were unauthorized and potentially damaging to the crown's reputation. Tom read the letter 3 times before its full meaning sank in. With a few carefully crafted sentences, the palace had officially erased decades of family history. The man who had been present at his important life events, who had offered guidance during difficult periods, who had been a constant figure in his mother's happiness, was now denying that any meaningful relationship existed between them. The cruelty of the timing made it even worse. Just 6 months earlier, Tom had been among the family members celebrating Charles's coronation. He had watched with pride as his mother was crowned queen consort, feeling that their long journey from scandal to acceptance had finally reached its conclusion. Now, that same institution that had seemed to embrace them was actively working to erase their existence from the royal narrative. Laura Lopez faced her own devastating moment of rejection. As an art curator, she had hoped to organize an exhibition featuring works from the royal collection, a project that would have combined her professional expertise with her unique access to royal treasures. The proposal she submitted was professionally prepared, academically sound, and personally meaningful. It would have been a way to contribute to the cultural legacy of the institution her stepfather now headed. The rejection came not through official channels, but through painful silence. Her carefully prepared proposal disappeared into the administrative machinery of the Royal Collection Trust, never to be acknowledged or returned. When she attempted to follow up through personal channels, calling numbers that had once connected her directly to Charles's office, she found herself routed through impersonal switchboards and anonymous assistants who claimed no knowledge of her or her proposal. The message was clear. Laura Lopez, the private citizen, could submit proposals like anyone else, but Laura Lopez, the stepdaughter, no longer existed in the palace's recognition. The special access, the family connections, the personal relationships that had defined her connection to the royal world for decades had been officially terminated. Camilla watched these developments with growing anguish. As queen consort, she was expected to support her husband's decisions without question, to present a united front in all matters concerning the monarchy. But, as a mother, she was witnessing the systematic destruction of her children's relationships with a man they had grown to love and respect. The private conversations between Charles and Camilla during this period became increasingly strained. Friends who knew them both reported that the easy intimacy that had characterized their decades-long relationship was being tested by the impossible position they found themselves in. Charles, under enormous pressure from advisors who painted every decision in terms of institutional survival, defended the necessity of maintaining clear boundaries. Camilla, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her children, struggled to find ways to preserve family relationships within the new constraints of royal protocol. The breaking point came during what should have been a moment of family celebration. In April 2023, Laura's daughter gave birth to her first child, making Camilla a grandmother once again. In the past, such occasions had brought the extended family together, with Charles taking genuine pleasure in his role as step-grandfather to Laura's growing family. But this time, there was no call from Charles. No flowers, no card, no acknowledgement that a new member of the family had arrived. The silence was deafening and, for Laura, the final confirmation that the man she had once considered a second father no longer saw her children as part of his family. When Camilla tentatively suggested that they visit the new baby together, Charles's response revealed the full extent of how royal calculations had overtaken personal feelings. Any public appearance with Laura and her family, he explained, would generate media coverage that would inevitably focus on the complicated history of their relationship. Photos of him holding his step-granddaughter would revive stories about his affair with Camilla, about the breakdown of his marriage to Diana, about all the controversies the new reign was trying to move beyond. The institutional logic was unassailable, but the personal cost was devastating. Camilla found herself forced to choose between supporting her husband's royal duties and maintaining relationships with her own grandchildren. The woman who had fought for decades to be accepted as part of the royal family was now discovering that acceptance had come at the price of isolating herself from the family she had brought with her. The media began to notice the absence of the Parker Bowles family from royal events. Society photographers who had grown accustomed to including Tom and Laura in their coverage of royal gatherings noted their conspicuous absence. Royal correspondents started asking pointed questions about the whereabouts of the Queen Consort's children, questions that were met with increasingly evasive responses from palace officials. The palace's handling of these inquiries revealed the depth of the strategic thinking behind the family's exclusion. Rather than acknowledging the Parker Bowles family's absence, royal press officers developed a careful line that emphasized the distinction between working royals and private family members. The implication was clear: Tom and Laura had never been official members of the royal family, and therefore their presence or absence at royal events was not a matter of public concern. This official position required a stunning rewriting of recent history. Photos from the past decade showing Tom and Laura at royal events were quietly removed from official palace galleries. Press releases from previous years that had mentioned their attendance at family celebrations were edited or deleted from royal websites. The systematic erasure was so thorough that someone researching the royal family's recent history might conclude that Camilla's children had never been part of the royal circle at all. For Tom and Laura, watching their own history being rewritten in real time was profoundly disorienting. They found themselves gaslit by an institution that was actively denying relationships they had lived and experienced for decades. Friends and colleagues who asked about their royal connections received conflicting information. The palace claimed no significant relationship existed, while their own memories and photo albums told a very different story. The emotional toll on the family was severe. Tom, who had always been the more publicly visible of Camilla's children, found his professional life affected by the confusion surrounding his royal connections. Book publishers and television producers who had previously been eager to work with him began expressing uncertainty about his status. The royal connection that had once opened doors was now a source of professional complications and personal embarrassment. Laura retreated further from public life, unwilling to risk additional rejection or humiliation. Her work in the art world, which had previously benefited from her cultural connections and social network, suffered as she struggled to navigate relationships that had suddenly become fraught with unspoken tensions about her royal associations. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate family. Camilla's siblings, who had also enjoyed access to royal events and had developed their own relationships with Charles over the years, found themselves similarly distanced. Invitations that had once been routine stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The entire extended Parker Bowles family network that had been gradually integrated into royal circles was systematically excluded. The silence that followed these changes was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation. Rather than honest conversations about the changing requirements of royal life, rather than explanations about the institutional pressures driving these decisions, the Parker Bowles family was left to piece together the reality of their new status from hints, absences, and carefully worded official statements. Charles himself seemed to retreat behind the protective barrier of royal protocol, using the formal structure of monarchy as a shield against the personal consequences of his decisions. The man who had once been accessible through personal phone calls and informal visits became unreachable except through official channels that treated his former family members like any other members of the public seeking royal attention. The transformation was so complete that by the summer of 2023, less than a year after Charles had become king, the Parker Bowles family had been effectively written out of the royal story. The people who had supported Camilla through decades of public criticism, who had accepted Charles into their family circle, who had helped him navigate the challenges of his controversial personal life, found themselves treated as strangers by the institution they had served loyally for so many years. The widening chasm between personal relationships and royal duty was becoming impossible to bridge. And, as the summer months passed, it became clear that this was not a temporary adjustment, but a permanent restructuring of family relationships to serve the perceived needs of the monarchy. The personal cost of wearing the crown was becoming evident, not just to Charles but to everyone who had once been part of his extended family circle. By the autumn of 2023, the systematic exclusion of the Parker Bowles family from royal life had created a powder keg of resentment and hurt that was about to explode in the most public and damaging way possible. What had begun as quiet institutional adjustments was about to become a full-blown crisis that would test the monarchy's ability to control its own narrative. The catalyst came from an unexpected source. Tom Parker Bowles had maintained his professional silence about his royal connections throughout the spring and summer, despite the personal pain of his exclusion from family life. His publisher had been pressing him to write a memoir that would capitalize on his unique perspective as the stepson of the king, but Tom had consistently refused, feeling that such a book would betray the trust that had once existed between him and Charles. However, everything changed when Tom discovered that the palace was actively working to undermine his professional reputation. A booking agent who had worked with Tom for years called to inform him that Clarence House had contacted several major television networks, suggesting that Tom's royal connections were overstated and that his access to palace life was not as extensive as he had previously claimed. The palace's campaign to rewrite history was not content with simply excluding the Parker Bowles family from future events. It was actively trying to diminish their past significance. The institutional memory was being scrubbed so thoroughly that even Tom's legitimate professional achievements were being questioned because of their association with royal access. This final betrayal pushed Tom beyond his breaking point. If the palace was going to attack his professional reputation while simultaneously denying their family relationship, he decided that the time for dignified silence had ended. The book project he had rejected multiple times suddenly became not just professionally attractive, but personally necessary. The Other Side of the Crown, a stepson's story, would become the literary bombshell that the palace had feared for years. Tom's proposal, delivered to his publisher in September 2023, promised an insider's account of royal life from someone who had been present for decades of private family moments, but who was now free to speak without concern for maintaining relationships that had already been destroyed. The announcement of the book deal created panic at Clarence House. Palace lawyers immediately contacted Tom's publisher, threatening legal action if the book contained any confidential information or violated privacy agreements. But Tom's legal team had done their homework. As someone who had been systematically excluded from royal life and whose family relationships had been officially denied, he was no longer bound by the informal loyalty agreements that typically constrained royal family members. The palace's frantic attempts to stop publication only generated more publicity for the project. News of the legal threats leaked to the media, creating exactly the kind of royal controversy that Charles had been trying to avoid. Headlines about the king trying to silence his stepson dominated the British press for days, with journalists digging into the story of the Parker Bowles family's exclusion from royal life. Laura Lopez, who had maintained a much lower public profile than her brother, found herself drawn into the controversy when journalists began investigating the broader pattern of family exclusion. Her attempts to organize the Royal Collection exhibition, previously known only to a small circle of art world professionals, became public knowledge when a curator who had worked on the proposal spoke to reporters about the project's mysterious disappearance into palace bureaucracy. The revelation that Charles's stepdaughter, a respected art professional, had been denied the opportunity to work with royal treasures created its own wave of negative publicity. Art critics and cultural commentators questioned whether the monarchy was sacrificing cultural opportunities because of personal politics. Museum directors who had previously sought partnerships with the royal collection began reconsidering their relationships with an institution that seemed to prioritize family feuds over cultural excellence. Camilla found herself in an impossible position as these stories dominated the news cycle. As queen consort, she was expected to support the palace's position publicly while privately watching her children being attacked by the institution she had married into. The woman who had spent decades trying to build bridges between her two families now found herself forced to watch as those bridges were systematically destroyed. The media feeding frenzy intensified when Tom gave his first interview about the book project. Appearing on a popular morning television show, he spoke with careful dignity about his decision to tell his story. His comments were measured and respectful, but their impact was devastating. "I think people deserve to know the truth about how this family really works," Tom said, looking directly into the camera. "For 30 years, I called Charles family. He was at my graduation, my wedding, the birth of my children. He was the man my mother loved, and we welcomed him into our lives without reservation. If that relationship means so little to him now that he can pretend it never existed, then perhaps people should understand what that says about the kind of person who wears the crown." The interview was watched by over 8 million viewers, making it one of the most watched royal-related broadcasts of the year. Social media exploded with commentary, much of it sympathetic to Tom's position. The hashtag #StepSonBanished began trending on Twitter, with thousands of users sharing their own stories about family rejection and institutional betrayal. Charles's advisors recognized that they were facing a public relations disaster. The king who had promised to modernize and humanize the monarchy was being portrayed as a cold, calculating figure who abandoned family members when they became inconvenient. Focus groups commissioned by the palace showed that public sympathy was strongly with the Parker Bowles family, with many people seeing their treatment as evidence of royal callousness and hypocrisy. The palace's response to the crisis revealed the depth of their miscalculation. Rather than acknowledging any mistakes or attempting to reconcile with the excluded family members, they doubled down on their position, issuing statements that further emphasized the distinction between official royal duties and private family matters. The tone-deaf response only reinforced the perception that the monarchy was more concerned with protecting its image than with treating people decently. Behind the scenes, the crisis was taking a severe toll on Charles personally. Friends reported that the king was struggling with the realization that his attempt to streamline royal relationships had backfired spectacularly. The man who had spent his entire life preparing to be king was discovering that some aspects of modern monarchy required skills that 70 years of preparation had not provided. The stress of the situation was also affecting Charles's relationship with Camilla. Palace insiders reported that the royal couple were having their most serious disagreements since their marriage, with Camilla increasingly unwilling to remain silent while her children were being publicly attacked by her husband's institution. The private conversations between them became tense affairs, with Camilla torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her children. The situation deteriorated further when Laura decided to break her own silence. In a carefully crafted statement released through her lawyer, she expressed her disappointment with the way her family had been treated but maintained her respect for the institution of monarchy. However, she also made clear that she would not remain silent if the palace continued to attack her brother's credibility. "My family has served this country and this institution with loyalty and discretion for over 3 decades, Laura's statement read. "We have never sought to profit from our relationships or to exploit our access to royal life. But we will not allow our reputations to be destroyed or our history to be rewritten simply because it has become politically convenient to pretend we never existed." The statement was notable for its dignity and restraint, but it also contained an implicit threat. If the palace continued its campaign against the Parker Bowles family, Laura was prepared to speak more openly about her own experiences and observations from decades of royal access. The crisis reached its peak when excerpts from Tom's book were leaked to the Sunday Times. The leaked passages revealed intimate details about royal family life that painted Charles in an unflattering light. Stories about his treatment of palace staff, his demands for special accommodation, and his sometimes petty behavior toward family members created a picture of a man whose public persona masked a much less appealing private character. One particularly damaging excerpt described a Christmas dinner at which Charles had criticized the Parker Bowles family's table manners, suggesting that they needed to raise their standards if they wanted to continue being included in royal gatherings. The story, true or not, perfectly captured the perception of Charles as a snob who looked down on his wife's family despite their years of loyalty and support. The palace's response to the leaks was swift and desperate. Legal teams threatened not just Tom's publisher, but also the newspaper that had published the excerpts. However, the legal threats only generated more publicity, with other media outlets picking up the story and analyzing the leaked passages in detail. Public opinion polls commissioned by various news organizations showed that the monarchy's reputation was suffering serious damage. Support for Charles personally had dropped to levels not seen since the darkest days of his divorce from Diana. More troubling for palace strategists, the crisis was reinforcing negative perceptions about the monarchy among younger demographics who were already skeptical about the institution's relevance in modern Britain. The breaking point came when Camilla herself was forced to cancel a planned public engagement after being confronted by protesters who accused her of abandoning her own children for the sake of royal privilege. The image of the Queen consort being shouted at by angry citizens who supported her children against her husband created a new level of crisis for the palace. The monarchy that Charles had inherited from his mother had been built on respect, dignity, and the perception of family unity. In less than 18 months as king, Charles had managed to transform his family relationships into a public relations nightmare that threatened the very foundations of royal authority. The institution that had survived world wars, constitutional crises, and decades of scandal was now facing a new kind of threat. The revelation that its supposed family values were a carefully constructed facade that could be abandoned whenever institutional convenience demanded it. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences would reshape not just the royal family, but the entire relationship between the monarchy and the British people. The winter of 2023 would prove to be the darkest period of Charles's reign, as the Parker Bowles family crisis spiraled into a full-scale institutional emergency that threatened to undermine everything the new king had hoped to achieve. What had begun as a calculated decision to modernize royal relationships had become a public relations catastrophe that was reshaping how Britain viewed its monarchy. The publication of The Other Side of the Crown in November 2023 hit the royal family like a guided missile aimed directly at the heart of their carefully constructed public image. Tom Parker Bowles had written his memoir with surgical precision, avoiding sensational accusations while methodically documenting decades of intimate family moments that revealed the complex realities behind royal formality. The book's most devastating passages were not the explosive revelations that palace officials had feared, but rather the quiet, detailed accounts of ordinary family life that made Charles's subsequent rejection of these relationships seem both cruel and inexplicable. Tom wrote about Christmas mornings when Charles had helped him assemble toys for his children, about quiet conversations over dinner where the future king had offered personal advice during difficult periods, about moments of genuine warmth and affection that had characterized their relationship for over 2 decades. These intimate details created a picture of a family that had functioned successfully for years until institutional calculations had destroyed personal bonds. The book's power lay not in scandalous accusations, but in its documentation of authentic relationships that had been sacrificed for abstract strategic goals that seemed increasingly difficult to justify. The public response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative for the palace. Book sales exceeded all expectations, with the memoir becoming the fastest-selling royal biography in British publishing history. More damaging still, the book's readers were not primarily royal gossip enthusiasts, but ordinary people who saw in Tom's story a reflection of their own experiences with family rejection and institutional betrayal. Social media platforms became forums for discussions about family loyalty, institutional callousness, and the human cost of political calculations. The #RoyalFamilyValues hashtag became a space where people shared their own stories of being rejected by family members who prioritized social status over personal relationships. The Parker Bowles family crisis had tapped into broader anxieties about authenticity, loyalty, and the price of social advancement in modern Britain. Charles found himself facing a crisis unlike any his mother had ever encountered. Queen Elizabeth II had weathered scandals involving individual family members, but she had never faced a situation where the monarchy itself was being questioned for its treatment of people who had shown nothing but loyalty to the institution. The criticism was not about royal behavior in public, but about royal character in private, a much more fundamental challenge to the monarchy's moral authority. The palace's traditional crisis management strategies proved inadequate for this new kind of threat. Past royal scandals had typically involved individual misconduct that could be isolated and contained. But the Parker Bowles situation raised questions about the institutional values of the monarchy itself, about whether an institution that claimed to represent British values could justify such apparently cruel treatment of family members. Focus groups commissioned by palace strategists revealed the depth of the damage. Members of the public consistently described Charles's treatment of the Parker Bowles family using words like heartless, calculating, and unforgivable. More troubling still, many people explicitly connected this behavior to broader questions about Charles's fitness to be king and the monarchy's relevance to modern British life. The crisis deepened when Laura Lopez decided to give her own television interview. Unlike her brother's book, which had been carefully crafted over months, Laura's appearance on a primetime current affairs program was immediate, emotional, and devastating in its impact. Sitting across from Britain's most respected television journalist, Laura spoke with quiet dignity about watching a man she had considered a father systematically erase her family from his life. Her voice broke when she described trying to explain to her own children why their grandfather Charles could no longer see them, why the man who had been present at every important family celebration was now too busy to take their phone calls. "I understand that being king comes with sacrifices," Laura said, tears visible in her eyes. "But I don't understand how a man can claim to serve his people while abandoning the people who loved him most. My children don't understand politics or royal protocol. They just know that Grandpa Charles used to read them stories, and now he won't even speak to their mother." The interview was watched by over 12 million viewers, making it one of the most watched television programs of the year. The image of Laura's tears became iconic, appearing on front pages across Britain and around the world. The photograph captured something that decades of royal public relations had tried to avoid: the human cost of royal duty made visible and personal. The international reaction was particularly damaging to Charles's reputation. Commonwealth countries that were already questioning their relationships with the British monarchy saw the Parker Bowles crisis as evidence of the institution's moral bankruptcy. Republican movements in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand used the family crisis as ammunition in their campaigns to remove Charles as head of state. "If this is how the king treats his own family," asked the leader of Australia's Republican movement, "how can we trust him to represent our national values?" The monarchy has revealed itself to be an institution that prioritizes political calculation over basic human decency. The damage extended beyond political calculations to affect Charles personally in ways that his advisors had not anticipated. The king, who had spent decades cultivating relationships with cultural figures, environmental activists, and community leaders, found that many of these connections were being reconsidered in light of his treatment of his stepchildren. Letters arrived at Clarence House from artists, writers, and activists who had previously supported Charles's various charitable causes. Many of these letters expressed disappointment and disillusionment with a man they had admired for his commitment to social causes, but who now appeared to lack basic compassion in his personal relationships. The Prince's Trust, Charles's flagship charity, reported a significant drop in donations and volunteer applications. Young people who had previously been inspired by the charity's mission were now questioning whether they wanted to be associated with an organization founded by someone whose personal behavior seemed to contradict the values of inclusion and support that the trust claimed to represent. Camilla's position during this period was particularly tragic. The woman who had fought for decades to gain acceptance from the British public was now watching her hard-won reputation being destroyed by the very institution that had finally embraced her. Her attempts to mediate between her husband and her children were frustrated by palace protocols that made private family conversations almost impossible to arrange. The Queen Consort's own public engagements became increasingly difficult as protesters and journalists confronted her with questions about her children's treatment. The image of Camilla being asked why she had chosen the crown over her kids became another devastating photograph that reinforced the narrative of royal callousness. Behind the palace walls, the crisis was creating unprecedented tension between Charles and his senior advisors. The king was beginning to question whether the strategic calculations that had led to the Parker Bowles exclusion had been worth the enormous cost in public trust and personal relationships. Some courtiers began privately suggesting that the only way to end the crisis was to reverse course completely, to publicly acknowledge the mistakes that had been made, and to welcome the Parker Bowles family back into royal life. However, other advisors argued that such a reversal would be seen as weakness and would encourage other challenges to royal authority. The deadlock within the palace meant that the crisis continued to fester without resolution. Each day brought new negative headlines, new expressions of public disappointment, and new questions about Charles's character and competence as monarch. The institution that prided itself on its ability to weather any storm was discovering that some crises could not be managed through traditional royal methods. The most damaging development came when several former palace employees began speaking to journalists about the atmosphere of fear and calculation that had characterized Charles's transition to the throne. These unnamed sources painted a picture of a court where personal relationships were constantly evaluated for their strategic value, and where family members were treated as assets to be managed rather than people to be loved. One particularly damaging account described a meeting where senior courtiers had created a spreadsheet listing all of Charles's family relationships and rating them according to their potential benefit or harm to the monarchy's reputation. According to this source, the Parker Bowles family had been rated as high risk, low benefit, and marked for systematic exclusion. Whether true or not, the story reinforced the public perception of Charles as a calculating figure who saw even his closest relationships in purely strategic terms. The image of family members being reduced to entries on a spreadsheet became a powerful symbol of everything that seemed wrong with the modern monarchy. By December 2023, polling showed that public support for the monarchy had reached its lowest levels in decades. More troubling still, the decline in support was not limited to traditional Republican constituencies, but was evident across all demographic groups, including older voters who had traditionally been strong monarchist supporters. The crisis had achieved something that years of Republican campaigning had failed to accomplish. It had made ordinary people question not just individual royal behavior, but the fundamental values and character of the monarchical institution itself. The palace in crisis was discovering that in the modern world, institutional authority could not survive the perception of institutional cruelty. As 2023 drew to a close, Charles faced a terrible choice. He could continue defending the strategic decisions that had led to this crisis, risking further damage to the monarchy's reputation and his own legacy. Or he could admit that fundamental mistakes had been made and attempt to repair relationships that might already be damaged beyond healing. The palace in crisis had become a symbol of an institution struggling to balance ancient traditions with modern expectations, personal relationships with political necessities, and family loyalty with royal duty. The decisions Charles made in the coming months would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The new year of 2024 arrived with King Charles III facing the greatest challenge of his 75 years of life and 18 months as monarch. The Parker Bowles family crisis had evolved from a private family matter into a full-scale constitutional crisis that threatened to undermine the very foundations of the British monarchy. The choices Charles made in the coming months would determine whether the institution he had inherited would survive in recognizable form. The catalyst for what would become known as the Palace Reckoning came from an unexpected source. Prince William, heir to the throne and previously supportive of his father's modernization efforts, requested a private meeting with Charles in early January 2024. The conversation that followed would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the crisis and force the king to confront the true cost of his strategic decisions. William had watched the family crisis unfold with growing alarm, not just as a member of the royal family, but as a future king who would inherit whatever remained of the monarchy's reputation after his father's reign ended. The prince who had spent his adult life preparing for his eventual role as sovereign understood that the Parker Bowles crisis represented more than a family dispute. It was a test of whether the monarchy could maintain public trust while making difficult institutional decisions. "Father," William said during their private conversation at Sandringham, "I need you to understand what this crisis is doing to the monarchy's future. I've spent 20 years building relationships with the people I'll need to work with when I become king. Those relationships are being destroyed by the perception that our family abandons people who become inconvenient." The prince's words carried special weight because they came from someone who had generally supported Charles's efforts to streamline and modernize royal operations. William had been one of the few family members who initially understood the strategic thinking behind reducing the extended royal circle. But he had also watched public opinion polling and focus group reports that showed the devastating impact of the Parker Bowles exclusion on public trust in the monarchy. More troubling still, William reported conversations with political leaders who were beginning to question whether the monarchy could continue to serve as a unifying force for the country when its own family relationships appeared to be governed by cold political calculation rather than basic human values. The prince had heard senior government ministers privately expressing concerns about the monarchy's moral authority during a period when the country faced its own challenges with social division and institutional trust. Charles listened to his son's concerns with growing recognition that the crisis had expanded far beyond what he had intended or imagined. The strategic decision to distance the monarchy from potentially complicated family relationships had been based on careful analysis of risks and benefits. But Neither he nor his advisors had anticipated that the exclusion would be perceived as evidence of fundamental character flaws that undermined the monarchy's claim to represent British values. The king's own private polling, conducted by his most trusted advisors, confirmed William's assessment. Public support for the monarchy had not just declined, it had collapsed among crucial demographic groups. Young people, who represented the monarchy's future, increasingly saw the institution as hypocritical and out of touch. Even more damaging, traditional monarchist constituencies were expressing disappointment with Charles personally, viewing his treatment of the Parker-Bowles family as evidence of poor character and judgment. The international implications were equally serious. Commonwealth countries that maintained Charles as head of state were facing increasing pressure from Republican movements that used the family crisis as evidence that the British monarchy no longer represented values compatible with modern democratic societies. Several Caribbean nations had already initiated formal discussions about removing Charles as their head of state, explicitly citing concerns about the monarchy's moral leadership. Perhaps most painful for Charles personally was the growing recognition that his attempt to protect the monarchy from association with his controversial past had actually reinforced the very narratives he had hoped to overcome. By distancing himself from the Parker-Bowles family, he had reminded the public of the affair that had destroyed his first marriage, while simultaneously demonstrating that he was willing to abandon people who had supported him during his most difficult periods. The strategic miscalculation was profound and irreversible through traditional palace crisis management. No amount of positive publicity about royal duties or charitable work could overcome the fundamental perception that Charles lacked basic human decency in his personal relationships. The monarchy's moral authority had been undermined by the king's own actions, creating a crisis that threatened the institution's long-term survival. Camilla's position during this period reflected the personal tragedy at the heart of the crisis. The queen consort had achieved everything she had sought for decades: marriage to Charles, acceptance by the public, and recognition as a legitimate member of the royal family. But these achievements had come at the cost of her relationship with her own children, who were now international symbols of royal cruelty and institutional callousness. The strain on Camilla's mental health became apparent to those close to her. Friends reported that she was struggling with depression and anxiety, torn between loyalty to her husband and love for her children. The woman who had endured decades of public criticism for her role in Charles's divorce was now facing a different, but equally devastating form of public judgment for her apparent abandonment of her family. The turning point came when Camilla made a decision that shocked both Charles and his advisors. In February 2024, without consulting the palace communications team, the queen consort placed a personal phone call to Tom Parker-Bowles. The conversation, which lasted over an hour, was an emotional attempt to rebuild a relationship that had been destroyed by institutional calculations. Tom later described the call as heartbreaking, with his mother tearfully acknowledging the pain that palace decisions had caused while trying to explain the impossible position she found herself in as queen consort. For the first time since the crisis began, a member of the royal family had reached out personally to address the human cost of institutional policies. The phone call, when it became public knowledge, created a new dynamic in the crisis. The image of a mother choosing her children over royal protocol resonated powerfully with public opinion. Social media responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many people praising Camilla for showing the human compassion that had been missing from the palace's handling of the crisis. However, Camilla's initiative also created new tensions within the royal household. Charles and his advisors viewed her unilateral outreach as undermining the strategic position they had spent months defending. If the queen consort was acknowledging mistakes and expressing regret, how could the palace continue to maintain that the Parker-Bowles exclusion had been justified and necessary? The internal divisions within the royal household became public when stories began appearing in the press about disagreements between Charles and Camilla over family policy. Palace sources, speaking anonymously, described heated arguments between the royal couple about the handling of the Parker-Bowles situation. These reports of private disagreements further damaged the monarchy's reputation by suggesting that even Charles's closest advisors and family members questioned his judgment and character. The crisis reached its climax in March 2024 when Tom Parker-Bowles announced that he would be giving testimony to a parliamentary committee investigating the monarchy's use of public funds. The committee had been established to examine royal finances, but Tom's offer to testify about his family's treatment had expanded the inquiry into broader questions about royal accountability and character. The prospect of Charles's stepson testifying before Parliament about royal family dysfunction represented a constitutional crisis without precedent in modern British history. Never before had a member of the royal family faced the possibility of being publicly questioned by elected officials about personal behavior and character. Palace lawyers worked desperately to prevent Tom's testimony, arguing that parliamentary questioning of royal family matters violated constitutional principles about the separation of powers. However, legal experts pointed out that Tom was not technically a member of the royal family, according to the palace's own recent statements, and therefore enjoyed the same rights as any other citizen to speak to Parliament about matters of public interest. The legal and constitutional complexities created a political nightmare for the government, which found itself caught between defending royal prerogatives and supporting parliamentary sovereignty. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who had maintained careful neutrality during the family crisis, was forced to address questions about the monarchy's constitutional role and accountability. The Prime Minister's statement, delivered in the House of Commons, was carefully crafted to avoid taking sides while acknowledging the seriousness of the constitutional questions raised by the crisis. However, the fact that the head of government felt compelled to address royal family behavior in Parliament represented a level of institutional scrutiny that the monarchy had not faced in living memory. Charles finally recognized that the crisis had grown beyond his ability to control through traditional palace methods. The strategic decision to exclude the Parker Bowles family had created consequences that threatened not just his personal reputation, but the constitutional stability of the monarchy itself. The institution he had inherited from his mother was facing an existential crisis that demanded unprecedented action. The king's decision to personally contact Tom Parker Bowles came in late March 2024, just days before the scheduled parliamentary testimony. The phone call, which Charles made without consulting his advisors, was an attempt to address directly the human damage that institutional policies had caused. The conversation between Charles and Tom, details of which later emerged through carefully placed leaks, represented the first honest acknowledgement by the king that fundamental mistakes had been made. Charles reportedly expressed personal regret for the pain that palace decisions had caused while acknowledging that strategic considerations had been allowed to override basic human decency. Tom's response to his stepfather's outreach was measured but significant. While not immediately withdrawing his offer to testify before Parliament, he agreed to postpone his appearance to allow time for family reconciliation efforts. The gesture demonstrated that despite everything that had happened, the possibility of rebuilding relationships still existed if the royal family was willing to acknowledge its mistakes and change its approach. The public response to news of Charles's personal outreach was cautiously positive but conditional. Opinion polls showed that while people appreciated the king's apparent recognition of his mistakes, public trust would only be restored through sustained changes in behavior rather than symbolic gestures. The Parker Bowles crisis had fundamentally altered the relationship between the monarchy and the British people. The institution that had survived world wars, constitutional crises, and decades of scandal had been brought to the brink of irrelevance by its own treatment of family relationships. The reckoning had forced Charles to confront the reality that in the modern world, institutional authority depended ultimately on personal character and moral consistency. As the crisis moved toward resolution, one thing had become clear. The monarchy that emerged from this period would be fundamentally different from the one Charles had inherited. The price of survival had been the recognition that royal families, like all families, must be governed by love and loyalty rather than strategic calculation. The silence that had once protected royal relationships had given way to demands for transparency and accountability that would reshape the institution for generations to come. The king who had sought to modernize the monarchy had learned the hard way that some aspects of human nature remain constant across centuries of institutional change. Trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt through sustained demonstration of character and commitment to the values the monarchy claimed to represent. The future of the British royal family would depend not on strategic communication or constitutional precedent, but on the simple human capacity for acknowledgement, forgiveness, and love.